Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into the source materials behind, honestly, one of the most chilling and extensive manhunts in recent American history, the search for the Golden State Killer. Our mission here isn't just to recount the crimes, horrific as they were. We're really digging into how a revolutionary forensic approach finally unmasked this monster next door after decades of silence. We're talking about a wave of terror that started back in the mid-70s. Quiet suburban communities in California, places like Sacramento, Orange County. This guy, he just seemed to melt away after his crimes. A spree of assaults, murders. It confused police across different areas for years. Eventually, it just went completely cold. Became like the definition of a cold case.
And I think if you look at the core takeaway from the sources, it's really this. This perpetrator was incredibly skilled at avoiding the usual police methods of the time. Physical evidence, witnesses, anonymity was his whole defense, built on operating in the dark, leaving few traces, and frankly, exploiting the lack of coordination between different police departments. So this deep dive really shows how his own biology, his DNA, linked through distant relatives he never even knew existed, became the piece of data that finally broke through all that. He banked on 20th century policing limitations, but he just couldn't have foreseen the data power of the 21st.
Okay, let's go back to the start then. The 1970s Sacramento area. He's initially called the East Area Rapist.
Yeah.
And his MO, his method, it really tells you a lot about him, doesn't it?
Wow.
Masked, moved silently, incredibly meticulous. The sources really stress how little he left behind, almost no usable fingerprints.
Exactly. And what really strikes you about those early attacks isn't just the violence, but the calculated psychological element. He'd often target couples, he'd tie up the man first, very methodically, sometimes using complex knots, which hinted at some kind of training maybe.
Right.
But then, almost to just flaunt his control, he'd do these really unsettling things after the main assault, like wander into the kitchen, grab some food from their fridge,
Right.
or just stand over the victims, whispering things. It blurred
Yeah.
between a violent predator and someone just casually invading their entire life.
That casual cruelty, yeah. That's what must have terrified people. It wasn't just a quick in-and-out crime. It was this prolonged violation of their safest space, their psyche, hours sometimes. And that psychological stuff, it didn't even stop when he left. You mentioned the sources talking about those phone calls. Years later.
Yeah. Those are particularly chilling. He'd call victims, sometimes just breathing heavily into the phone, other times whispering these awful things.
Like, remember when we played?
Exactly like that. Or just asking, "Are you awake?" It shows a kind of twisted sophistication, doesn't it? He understood terror wasn't just a one-time event. He was creating this lasting psychological scar while being incredibly careful to erase his physical trail. It's that contradiction that must have driven investigators absolutely crazy.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. Late 70s, early 80s, the violence ramps up significantly. The attacks, they shift from primarily sexual assault to include incredibly brutal murders, bludgeoning, strangulation. It's a clear escalation.
And this is where the investigation really started hitting walls, especially with the way policing worked back then. The killer, or maybe killers as some thought initially, kept moving. He'd be active in Sacramento, then pop up down in Santa Barbara, then later in Orange and Ventura counties, and because each police department was kind of siloed.
They all gave him different names, right, based on their local cases.
Precisely. So you had the East Area Rapist up north.
Then the original Night Stalker in Santa Barbara.
And down south, sometimes called the Diamond Knot Killer because of those specific knots he occasionally used.
So different names, slightly different details maybe in each area.
Yeah, the types of knots, how he got into the houses might vary slightly. Combine that with, let's be honest, probably some jurisdictional rivalry and just poor communication between counties back then. It basically allowed the same guy to operate for years just by changing locations. It wasn't really until the early 2000s when DNA testing got good enough that they could finally link the genetic evidence from all these different crime scenes, all these different named offenders, and realize, oh my God, it's one person.
One ghost, essentially, they'd been chasing for decades under different guises. That must have been just a staggering moment for investigators.
Absolutely staggering. And incredibly frustrating, too, I imagine. Because now they knew it was one guy. They had his unique DNA profile. They just couldn't put a name to it.
Because his DNA wasn't in any of the criminal databases.
Yeah.
Like CODIS.
Exactly. Nothing matched at the local, state, or the federal level, which meant either he'd never been arrested for anything serious enough to get his DNA collected, or he'd just never been caught, period.
So they hit this wall, a technological wall. They have the who in terms of DNA, but not the who in terms of identity. The trail's ice cold.
That's the perfect description. They had this clear genetic fingerprint, what forensic labs call a 13-locus STR profile, but no matches. They were stuck. And that feeling of being completely stuck after decades of work, that's what pushed them towards something totally new, something pretty radical at the time.
Which brings us to 2018 and this breakthrough. Genetic genealogy. This is where the story takes a sharp turn into like 21st century science fiction almost.
Yeah.
How did they actually do that? Take old crime scene DNA and use it with websites people use to find, their great aunt.
It wasn't straightforward. It required a really significant technical jump. See, the DNA profile police labs use, the STR profile, it's great for matching suspect DNA directly to crime scene DNA or to a known offender in CODIS. But it's basically useless for finding relatives who aren't immediate family. Genealogy websites, like the one they used, GED Match, they rely on a different kind of DNA data, SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. That's the stuff that lets you trace ancestry back generations and find distant cousins.
So they had to somehow convert the old STR profile from the crime scene.
Flip into a format that looked like the SNP data used by these genealogy sites. It wasn't the original crime scene sample itself they uploaded, but a sort of translation of its genetic markers.
Got it. So they create this genealogical profile from the killer's DNA, upload it to GED Match, a public database where people voluntarily share their DNA results to build family trees.
Exactly. And the key thing is, the system didn't just spit out the killer's name. It couldn't. It flagged people who shared some DNA with the profile distant relatives.
How distant are we talking?
Sometimes really distant, like third cousins, fourth cousins, maybe even further out.
Wow. So that doesn't exactly narrow it down much, does it? A fourth cousin match could still mean hundreds, maybe thousands of people in that family tree.
Thousands, potentially. And that's where the sources emphasize the real heavy lifting began. It wasn't just the DNA hit. It was the meticulous genealogical research that followed.
So less high-tech lab work and more old-school family tree investigation.
Absolutely. The investigators, people like Paul Holes, essentially became forensic genealogists overnight. They took the family trees connected to these distant cousins found on GED Match. Then they started cross-referencing like crazy. Public records, obituaries, marriage licenses, birth records, old census data, property records, anything they could find.
Looking for connections, patterns.
Looking for connections, trying to build the family tree backwards towards a common ancestor and then forwards again across different branches. They were specifically hunting for a male born within a certain time frame who geographically could have been in the specific areas of California during the specific times the crimes occurred.
So they're using geography and timelines to prune this massive family tree.
Exactly, layering all that data. And slowly, painstakingly, they narrowed it down. From thousands of possibilities to hundreds, then maybe dozens, until finally the genealogical map pointed to just one person.
One man who fit the profile, the timeline, the geography, derived purely from a distant cousin's DNA and a mountain of genealogical legwork.
Incredible, isn't it? And that man was Joseph James D'Angelo.
A 72-year-old retiree living a quiet life in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. Just unbelievable.
And the irony hits you immediately, because when they looked into this Joseph D'Angelo, who does he turn out to be?
A former police officer.
A former police officer. He'd served in two different departments, Auburn and Exeter, back in the 70s, right during the East Area rapists' initial spree. The record showed he was actually fired from the Auburn department in 1979.
For shoplifting, wasn't it?
Yeah, for shoplifting a hammer and some dog repellent, believe it or not. And that firing happens right around the time the crimes escalate to murder and move south.
So the guy terrorizing these communities, the guy who knew how to avoid leaving clues, he actually had police training.
He knew procedures, he understood patrol patterns, evidence collection techniques, the importance of minimizing contact, avoiding fingerprints.
He was using his inside knowledge against them.
It certainly seems that way. It explains, perhaps, his incredible ability to evade capture for so long. He wasn't just guessing how police work, he knew.
The sources also mentioned he'd apparently watch victims' houses for weeks sometimes, learning routines.
Yes, detailed surveillance. Again, methodical. Calculating, using that knowledge of routines to plan his entry and attack when victims were most vulnerable.
Okay, so they have their prime suspect, D'Angelo. But they need definitive proof, right? They can't just arrest him based on the genealogy alone.
Correct. The genealogy pointed them to him, but they needed his direct DNA to match the crime scene evidence conclusively, so they put him under surveillance.
And this is where the discarded tissue comes in.
That's right. Classic detective work, really. They followed him, waited for him to discard something with his DNA on it. Eventually, he threw a used tissue into a trash can outside a store,
They collected it.
sent it to the lab, and the DNA from that tissue was a perfect match. A direct match to the DNA profile recovered from crime scenes decades earlier. The East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, it was him.
That final piece. A throwaway tissue after all that meticulous planning to avoid leaving traces.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it? Defeated by something so mundane.
So the arrest. April 2018. What was that like?
Well, the descriptions are stark. He just looked like an ordinary, frail old man. Neighbors were shocked. He was a quiet guy next door, a grandfather.
But inside his house, they found things.
They did. Items reportedly stolen from victims decades ago, cufflinks, jewelry, maybe other mementos. And chillingly, journals were mentioned, though the contents weren't fully detailed publicly.
And when they finally confronted him, what did he say? The sources mention a confession.
Yeah, according to reports from investigators in the room, when confronted with the evidence, the weight of it all, he apparently mumbled something to the effect of, "I did all that, and then, heartbreakingly, I didn't have the strength to stop."
Wow. Just, wow. Decades of silence? Then that. So the legal end. Justice finally caught up.
It did. In 2020, to avoid a lengthy trial that would have re-traumatized many victims, D'Angelo pleaded guilty.
To 13 murders and 13 related kidnapping charges, right?
Yeah.
Though the scope of his crimes, including the rapes, was much broader.
Correct. The plea covered the charges they could still legally prosecute due to statutes of limitation. He received multiple consecutive life sentences, no chance of parole, he'll die in prison.
A measure of justice, finally, for the victims and their families after so long.
Absolutely. But beyond the courtroom, the impact of this case, as we've discussed, it's just been monumental for law enforcement.
It completely changed the game for cold cases.
Fundamentally. The Golden State Killer case wasn't just a success for genetic genealogy. It was the success, the proof of concept that blew the doors open. It showed that if you had viable DNA evidence from an old crime scene, even decades old, that case wasn't necessarily cold anymore. It wasn't unsolvable.
That idea you mentioned earlier, hitting the unsolvable wall, suddenly there was a way over it.
Exactly. And the sources call it a genetic genealogy tsunami for a reason. Since D'Angelo's arrest in 2018,
Hundreds of cold cases solved.
Hundreds of previously impossible cold cases, murders, rapes, identifying unknown victims, Jane and John Doe's, have been cracked using the exact same technique pioneered here. It's been transformative.
So we're really in a new era now, if the evidence was preserved properly back then.
There's a very real chance the perpetrator can still be identified today, no matter how long ago the crime was committed. It's completely shifted the landscape for investigators, and maybe for criminals who thought they got away clean.
It circles back perfectly to the start, doesn't it? This deep dive showed a meticulous killer who expertly exploited the limits of old-school policing to remain anonymous. And he was ultimately undone by modern technology, connecting him through the most basic thing, shared family DNA, uploaded by relatives he likely never knew, the ultimate defeat of old-world secrecy by new-world data.
Precisely. He relied on being untraceable by traditional means. But his own genetic code, echoed in distant family members sharing data online, became the inescapable link. And that really leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to consider. If a killer this careful, this elusive for decades, can be unmasked because a fourth cousin decided to explore their ancestry online, what does that truly mean for the idea of a cold case or even personal anonymity going forward? In this age of interconnected data, can any hidden past truly stay buried forever?